So John 14, let's just take a quick look at John 14 and take a look at some of what it is that Jesus is saying to the disciples in the upper room. John 14, 1-3. Jesus says, "Let not your heart be troubled. Believe in God. Believe also in me. For in my Father's house are many dwelling places. If it were not so, I would have told you. For I go to prepare a place for you. And if I go and prepare a place for you, I will come again." For those who are wondering, is there any passage in the Bible that teaches the second coming of Jesus Christ? We just read it. Jesus himself said, "I will come again." And as certain as his second coming is, there is tremendous uncertainty just in that statement alone as to when it will be. So we've got to dig a little further. "I will come again and receive you to myself, that where I am," thinking prophetically to where he will be after his ascension from the Mount of Olives, as recorded in Acts chapter 1, "that where I am, there you may be also." It's often taught, generally by those of a liberal persuasion, that this is somehow a text about a believer's homegoing, but a believer's homegoing immediately ushers them into the presence of the Lord, and Jesus doesn't have to come for that to occur. And therefore it can't be talking about that. John 14, 1-3 does refer to the rapture and not to an individual believer's homecoming. And there's an amazing parallel between John 14 and 1 Thessalonians 4, 13-18. In both cases, it's talking about a sudden entrance into the presence of Christ. And in both cases, it's talking about that will bring peace, it will bring comfort, over which there should be no grieving whatsoever. There we find that Jesus promised to return again, but not to set up his kingdom. He promised to return again in order that where he was going, they might also be. And that's critical to observe. His coming is so that church-age saints will be with him in heaven. And thus, as I observed earlier, a post-trib rapture demands that you never get to heaven. If what Jesus is saying here is true, and we believe it is, a post-trib rapture negates it, because all you do is in the air meet Christ and then descend to the earth in order for him to set up his kingdom on earth. But if pre-tribulationism is true, then when Christ comes in the air and the saints are raptured out of the earth and they return to heaven, which is where he's going, then what he's promising in verses 1-3 actually does occur, and there's no contradiction. There's no clouding of the truth, and it's rather explicitly clear. And only a pre-trib rapture satisfies the language of John 14, 1-3. A mid-trib doesn't, and a post-trib doesn't. Let me add to that number 6. And this really, if I had to pick, I think, one line of reasoning to convince me of a pre-trib rapture, it would be number 6. And part of it's not written in your notes, and I'm going to have to give it to you. So I hope you see the glass half full. I gave you almost all that I'm going to say. Rather than half empty, I didn't give you everything I was going to say. So for you pessimists, my apology when you look at the glass half empty. For you optimists, may your tribe increase if you see the glass half full. And here's the statement that we would make. The sequence of events as proposed by a post-tribulational rapture of the church, the sequence of events at Christ's post-tribulational coming, and he does come at the end of Daniel's 70th week, but he comes to set up his kingdom on earth. The sequence of events at his post-tribulational coming demands a pre-tribulational rapture. And I want to explain what I mean by that. If you look at a number of different texts in 1 Thessalonians 4, in Matthew 24 and 25, and begin to compare them along with 1 Corinthians 15, it doesn't take too long before it's obvious that a post-tribulational coming to set up his kingdom can't be equated with a post-tribulational rapture of the church, or those texts would be contradicting themselves. And let me show you what I mean by what I say with a series of contrasts. And the series of contrasts are only telling us what the Bible tells us. Number one, when Christ gathers his own in 1 Thessalonians 4, it is Christ who gathers them. In Matthew 24, which clearly talks about the end of Daniel's 70th week, it isn't Christ who gathers the elect, it is whom? It is the angels who gather the elect. In one text, Christ gathers them, and the other, the angels gather them. And a pre-tribulation rapture anticipates that and explains that. Secondly, in 1 Thessalonians 4, resurrection is unmistakably prominent. However, in Matthew 24, resurrection is not a part of the picture whatsoever. Number three, in 1 Thessalonians 4, Christ comes to reward the saints. However, when he comes at the end of Daniel's 70th week, he comes to judge unbelievers. That's not enough. Let me give you a fourth. In 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, believers are the ones departing the earth because they've been snatched out of the earth. However, if you go to Matthew 24 and 25, it's the unbelievers who are taken away and the believers who are left behind. And again, these contrasts can only be explained as non-contradictory if, in fact, you have a pre-tribulation rapture before Daniel's 70th week when the saints are taken out, and if you have at Christ's second coming to the earth to establish his kingdom, there is no rapture. But there are several more. Number 5. It's implicit in the statement in 1 Thessalonians 4 that at the rapture of the church, unbelievers remain on the earth, and in fact are the initial inhabitants of Daniel's 70th week. However, Matthew 25, with the separation of the sheep and goats, the sheep remain, and who are the sheep? The believers. The goats depart, and who are they? They are the unbelievers. Unbelievers are departing at the end of Daniel's 70th week. Believers are departing at the beginning, and the only sequence of events that explains that is a pre-trib rapture and a post-trib coming of Christ to set up his kingdom. Let me give you a 6th, 7th, and 8th, and I'll quit that little list. In 1 Thessalonians 4, there's no talk of setting up the kingdom. It simply has to do with the death of loved ones who are buried. They'll be the first to be resurrected, and those who are alive and remain then will be caught up together with them for a grand reunion and to be with the Lord forever. However, in Matthew 24 and 25, which are clearly at the end of Daniel's 70th week, there is obvious talk of Christ coming to set up his kingdom. Two very, very distinct ideas. Number 7, in 1 Corinthians 15, which we read earlier, believers will be receiving glorified bodies at the time of the rapture. But at the end of Daniel's 70th week, with the coming of Christ and the ushering of the sheep as the initial inhabitants of the millennium, there is no talk about glorified bodies, and in fact couldn't be glorified bodies, or they couldn't propagate the human race. And eighthly, and lastly, at least in our little list, in 1 Thessalonians 4, Christ comes in the air and returns to heaven. But at the end of Daniel's 70th week, in Matthew 24 and 25, Christ comes and he continues to the earth to set up his kingdom. There are huge, decisive contrasts between what is occurring at the end of Daniel's 70th week and what's happening in conjunction with the rapture, and therefore they couldn't be happening at the very same time. And only a pre-tribulation rapture really deals with that sequence of events. Let me take that just a little bit further, if I could, not to belabor the point and realize that lunch is approaching quickly. If you want to turn there with me, you can, in Matthew 13, the great chapter on parables. There's just an observation that I want to make that we've alluded to already, but be a little more specific about it. As you read the parable of the wheat and the tares, as you read the parable of the dragnet, and then think of the Olivet Discourse, and that is the separation of the sheep with the goats and the departure of the faithful, it becomes very, very evident that at the end of Daniel's 70th week, unbelievers are taken out from among believers. The tares are taken out of the field and the wheat remains. The rotten, decaying fish are taken out from among the good fish which remain in the net. The goats are taken out from among the sheep and depart into God's judgment. And in every case, at the end of Daniel's 70th week, unbelievers are taken out from among believers and the believers remain. But just the opposite sequence occurs at the time of the rapture, as reported in 1 Thessalonians 4 and 1 Corinthians 15, and that is believers are taken away by the rapture and the unbelievers remain. And it could not be happening at the same time. One more thought along that line. And that is that a post-trib rapture, where you're caught up, you really don't make it to heaven, you immediately do a U-turn and come back down on earth because we got to set the kingdom up, really eliminates the judgment seat of Christ. It eliminates the marriage feast of the Lamb, both of which would appear to occur in heaven after the rapture. But a pre-tribulation rapture allows for all of that. The church is raptured, and during those 7 years in heaven, the Bema occurs, the marriage feast of the Lamb occurs, and then Christ comes to earth with his righteous army to set up his kingdom and to liberate it from the dominion of Satan and his demons.